Hi, I'm Faiza Rizvi, and I'd like to welcome you all to the ENP Plus roundtable discussion on net zero, myths, and realities. Joining me today are three panelists who will offer expert insights on the roadmap to net zero and the immediate actions that governments and businesses should take. We have with us Joshua Hagen, Sector Manager, Oil and Gas at Agreco. We also have Martha Ramos, Low Carbon Lead, Energy Systems North America at DNV. Also joining us is Antoine Haft, Chief Analyst and Co-founder at Kairos. Thank you all for being with us today, and a warm welcome to you all. Now, analysts agree that commitments are one thing, but achieving them is really quite another. And statistics show that the United States is currently on track for a 12% emission reduction by 2030, which is far below the 52% cut pledged by President Joe Biden. Now, looking at these statistics, how realistic is the net zero goal? Joshua, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's clear the technology necessary to begin or start affecting change exists today, as is public recognition that deep decarbonization is essential. A resounding 96% of respondents said their company's environmental impact was a medium to high priority, while green issues were also found to be more important factor than price. On first inspection, then, concern appears to be translating into action, especially when considering the 82% of respondents who confirmed their use of alternative fuels as a way of reducing corporate impact. Yet any notion of progress is soon cast into doubt when finding that 85% still identified diesel as their fuel of choice for powering on-site equipment. Insights like this point to a disconnect. Businesses are searching for ways to bring emissions down, prioritizing greener options wherever possible, yet there are also appears to be difficulty in the uptake of alternative energy sources. We have options today, but right now they can be geographically dependent. Accelerating the speed and scale we deploy options is critical to meeting targets.
Right, thank you for that insight, Joshua. Now, Martha, you're closely studying the North American market. We'd love to hear what you think on how close to reality is the net zero goal, really.
Yeah, and thank you. I kind of agree with Joshua. I mean, I would like to quote as well the energy transition outlook that DNV has issued, and we have included a forecast. And unfortunately, this forecast shows that achieving the Paris climate goals of reducing the global temperature rise doesn't seem to be realistic or practical, that we are in the right track. If we consider the current policies and technology deployment rates. So the forecast shows that about 1.5 degree carbon budget will probably be exhausted by 2028. And the 2-degree budget probably in 2051. So these elements were extrapolated based on the trends, and the outlook ended up pointed at 2.3 degrees warming of the planet by the end of this century, which this level, as we know, is considered dangerous by the world scientific community. So that's one element. We also, DNV forecast also shows that there's a significant increase in renewable electricity in the power systems and a massive uptake of electric vehicles. However, the energy system will still be more than 50% hydrocarbon-based by 2050. So many harder to abate sectors like high heat processing industry and heavy transport, they have progress with decarbonization, which includes efficiency gains, but they have fallen slow and behind what's required by the Paris Agreement. As Joshua was saying, technologies and solutions are there to decarbonize. They exist, they're proven, such as hydrogen and carbon capture, but the implementation has not been as fast as it should be, and only a handful of solutions have been applied at scale at this moment. So reaching the Paris Agreement goals does not seem to be achievable at the current pace of the transition that we're going.
Right, Martha, great insight. Thank you for that. Now, fossil fuels are making up 80% of the energy mix, and getting to net zero in 2050, which is barely 30 years from now, will be a monumental challenge. Antoine, if you could answer this one, what is the progress that the oil and gas industry is making, and where do we really stand right now?
That's a good question. There's no doubt we're going to have to live with fossil fuels for some time, even in a low carbon energy system. There's been a bit of a revolution in the oil and gas industry over the last few years, and just in the last year, so many companies have embraced net zero targets and have started to publish their views of how they can get to a cleaner footprint. The progress at the same time is still lacking. I mean, there's a big gap between the aspirational statements that companies are making and the emissions that they're releasing into the atmosphere. There's a progress, undoubtedly. And at Kairos, we have developed a tool that measures emissions across the globe in quasi-real time, comprehensively, using monitoring satellites. And what we see is, if we compare 2019 to 2020, for example, we do see a decrease in emissions. Some of it linked to lower economic activity and lower production of oil and gas. And this is in CO2 and in methane. But we do see a decrease in methane intensity in oil and gas production, at least in some areas in the US, for example, in the Permian Basin, in the Appalachian, in the Marcellus gas field, for example. But the emission intensity of gas production and oil production in the US is still very high. The same is true, generally speaking, across the world. So there's a huge need for improvement, but a huge potential for improvement. The oil and gas industry and the fossil fuel industry more generally, including coal, is responsible for a very large proportion of methane emissions worldwide, about 35%, but closer to 80% of large emission events, super emitters, large events that are very detrimental to the climate, but very easy to fix. A lot of that can be fixed at no cost or negligible cost, sometimes at the negative cost. So the potential for improvement is very dramatic, and that's something that makes us very hopeful.
Joshua, what are your thoughts on the industry's progress to achieving net zero?
So we've seen our customers shift to make massive investments in their net zero initiatives, but the changes don't happen overnight. The industry understands the need and is navigating the ways to achieve ESG targets. Some of those ways are better recognizing energy storage, battery storage, raising the efficiency of existing technologies. A good case in point would be incorporating newer or more efficient technologies that increase the efficiency or operation of current products like temporary power or power generation, actually operating that equipment at the optimal levels instead of what we often see of probably 20 to 50%. Alternative fuels is a big one, with HVO becoming more prevalent, power fuels or e-fuels, biomethanol and hydrogen, not to forget CHP. It's an oldie but a goodie that's becoming more prevalent.
Thank you, Joshua. Now, in its recent report, the International Energy Agency, or the IEA, has firmly stated that exploitation and development of new oil and gas fields must stop this year to meet the goal of net zero emissions by 2050. Martha, what are your thoughts on this wake-up call from the IEA?
So the IEA forecast reflects what would have to be done to reach net zero. That has to be clear. This is not a prediction or what is going to happen or what will likely happen. So it is rather, I would see it as a warning of what would need to happen to meet the net zero goals by 2050. And I think it's a reality check that we all need to think about, as it basically supports the arguments that the net zero goals by 2050 are seriously unrealistic and at the pace that we're going. So I think we have to see it that way. It's a call for people to understand that basically the clock is ticking. We don't have plenty of time to get to the levels that are needed to seriously delay the climate change impact that we're having right now with the emissions at the rate that is going. But yeah, we cannot see it as something that is a switch that we turn on and off in a minute and things can change so drastically, so quickly. But we do have to be very conscious that the steps that we're taking on policies, technology implementation, renewables, deployment have to be much quicker than what we're doing right now.
Great, you summarized it perfectly, Martha. Antoine, I know you've previously worked with the IEA, so we'd like to hear your thoughts first on this stern warning from the IEA.
Sure. Well, on the face of it, it sounds like the call to or the way the IEA is drawing attention to the need not to invest in new sources of oil and gas production sounds like a departure from the previous messages that the IEA has been putting forward. Just a couple of years ago, the IEA was raising the alarm and saying we're running the risk of a shortfall of oil supply if the industry did not invest more. So it sounds like an about face, but at the same time, if you think about it, this is already happening. This is reflecting the reality that's been happening on the ground for the last few years. It kind of depends in part on how you define new or not new. But if you look at the last few years since about 2014, since the price collapse of 2014, there really hasn't been so much investment in new sources of oil and gas. Most of the investment that's been made has been in existing fields or satellite fields, very close to existing infrastructure and existing fields, and mostly very short cycle projects. So I would say to some degree, the skill of the IEA often is to capture the mood of the time, to articulate the consensus view out in the industry. And as shocking as the message might seem today, in a way, it's just a kind of adjustment of the previous message and the catching up effort to really align more closely to what's been going on in the last few years. And the mood out there as we're waking up to the urgency of the need for climate action and the scope of the lift that needs to be made to reach net zero targets. But the IEA messages tend to vary over time, and I think they could very well change again. And in the next few years, we might realize that we can't get rid of oil and gas so quickly, and we might once again draw attention on the need to invest in oil and gas, but to invest in a more responsible way, in a way that's more mindful of emissions and that incorporates better stewardship of the climate and the atmosphere.
Right, perfect. Thank you. Thank you for that insight. Now, we discussed the progress to net zero and if the goal is realistic. But Joshua, can you expand a bit more on some of the biggest challenges that governments and oil companies face on their path to achieving net zero? Now, I know your company is doing some great work in this area, so we'd like to hear your thoughts.
Sure. So corporate contribution to net zero will be in part dependent on clear direction from government. Regulation will need updating and subsidies put in place to assist action. Yet leadership and business community will be central to effective long-term progress. Energy diversity will be central to this balancing act. It will offer businesses flexibility when moving to a carbon neutral operation and ease the burden of long-term challenges necessary to make the goal even a remote possibility. As we touched on earlier, some of the key challenges are high CapEx investment, technical obsolescence, maintenance and availability of a lot of the products and technologies.
Great, thank you, Joshua. Martha, what are your thoughts on some of the biggest challenges that we are facing?
So I would say there's different aspects of these challenges, right? So one of them is how quickly people can implement the new technologies that have to be implemented. So companies and the industry has to come together and collaborate. Lessons learned have to be shared. If we think about carbon capture, for example, and we think about plants that have been put in place, let's call it Petronova, for example, there are great lessons learned that could be there right now. It's not working, but if it starts working back up, all these learnings could be shared and then collectively progress the development and implementation of these type of technologies that come with great impact and solutions to the energy transition. So technology maturity, lowering the costs, ensuring that operations incorporate all these new ways of working towards the lowering the greenhouse gas emission are important. I think is also the perception that people have that varies depending on, if we think about Europe, if we think about the US, there's different ideas of how quickly we can get to a net zero environment, how can we get there? And there's a little bit sometimes of resistance of how we actually do that. You know, is carbon capture worth investing, or should we go directly to green hydrogen and only think about renewables? And what we see is that there's not one single path towards net zero. There are various solutions that need to be implemented. All of them will collectively get us to where we need to be. And all of these need to be quickly ramped up to make them scalable and commercially available. And then when we think about governments, is how quickly they can implement policies. And the US is making a good effort. They have the 45Q, and they have some other policies being evaluated. So how quickly they can do that. But at the same time, if we think about it, the transition is not just energy transition, it's an economic transition, it's an infrastructure transition that takes a lot of effort, a lot of investment, a lot of innovation, a lot of R&D, and a lot of conscious spending of where we put all our efforts so that we actually achieve the goals. So there are various challenges that we all as industry, governments, and all different entities will have to come together and collaborate and, as I say, invest resource and time to actually make it happen as fast as we can possibly do that.
Right. Thank you, Martha. Now, like you said, there isn't just one path to net zero, but there's several steps that need to be taken. And one such step that experts have called for is scaling up technologies, carbon capture and storage. What are some immediate steps that need to be taken in this area? Antoine, what are your thoughts on this?
Few things, but I think Martha is absolutely right. We need to deliver results quickly. And one of the challenges of governments is clearly to combine and to reconcile long-term objectives with the imperative to deliver meaningful reductions in emissions in the very short term, particularly methane. Methane is the biggest emergency because methane is the fastest rising greenhouse gas, and it's the one with one of the strongest greenhouse global warming potentials, 84 times the potential of carbon dioxide. So I think carbon capture is a big requirement. Forestry, natural-based solutions are going to be a big part of the answer for that. And in that space, having good measurement technologies, allowing the market to separate good forestry assets from bad ones, and to discriminate between good policies in terms of forestry and less effective or even detrimental ones is going to be key. That technology is now getting mature, and we have developed a tool at Kairos to monitor forestry assets in 3D in real time, and to assess the carbon content of forests. That's going to be very important to make afforestation or forestry an effective tool of dealing with emissions and getting us closer to net zero. Another key aspect is going to be to reduce methane. And there too, the technology is available. And the challenge for the government is really to accelerate adoption of the technology. The technology is there to measure, to detect, to attribute methane emissions to their sources, to enable companies to document the progress they're making towards reducing these emissions and to build trust in their operations, which is going to be very important for the industry to maintain trust in its stewardship and in its performance. So encouraging adoption of existing technology to remove methane is going to be very important.
Right, thank you, Antoine. Joshua, I'd like to hear your thoughts on carbon capture and storage, and I'd like to hear your final thoughts and comments on net zero myths and realities.
Sure. So I can definitely comment on the energy storage, since it's a product and a solution that we offer. Energy storage, for example, has continued to fall in price, yet seemingly remains cost prohibitive for most businesses without some form of subsidy. Risk may also prove an issue for battery uptake. Cost of lithium-ion batteries has fallen 85% in the past 10 years, but this is subject to change. The raw minerals needed for production are common across the world, yet some analysts believe supply will be inhibited by the lack of mines and the other facilities necessary for processing. As batteries are introduced in greater number, businesses will also have to reconcile their own energy profile changes with a growing need for resilience. Even if these stumbling blocks are managed, storage could create difficulties in the future. While rightly lauded for its ability to facilitate renewable energy, the technology is still relatively new and presents a financial risk for most organizations. Committing large amounts to a permanent solution may be challenging when improvements continue to be introduced to the market and the risk of technical obsolescence is high. Batteries are ideal in environments with fluctuating demand. The technology will ultimately allow for greater penetration of renewable energy, create a more dynamic generation, transmission, and distribution system, and enable transportation electrification, microgrids, and all visions of the future when it comes to energy management. As for carbon capture, one of the obstacles that I don't think is discussed often enough is the total electrical demand required to operate such a large scale capture program that I'm fairly confident will be addressed here shortly.
Great, thank you, Joshua. Martha, the floor is yours now to give some final thoughts and comments about carbon capture and storage.
When we talk about carbon capture, I go back to what I was mentioning before. Some elements is the perception and how much trust we have and how it's going to be done. So I think at this moment, I'd like to highlight what industry is doing. And for example, in DNV, we try to make sure that we work towards industry gaining trust. And Antoine was mentioning trust and how confident people are in their operations. So deploying and coming up with standards and guidelines on how to do better carbon capture, that's something we have been working on in DNV, and we see something that element is important, how to make sure that we look at the capturing, which is a key element, and how much energy goes into the capturing and how the compression is being done. If we think about transportation, the pipeline infrastructure in the US, we still is not quite there yet as we need it. So that has to be scaled up. And right now there's the SCALE Act that is being proposed in the US that intends to create that infrastructure. So hopefully those type of acts will pass, because then we stop with what should go first, right? The intention of this is to cluster emitters and hubs and then be able to store and sequester this CO2 in the large capacity that the US has. So if we think about technology infrastructure, that has to be there. And then the part of sequestration. So we also have guidelines that provide how to make sure that the containment is kept there for as long as it has to be done. The monitoring, reporting, and verification of these fields is also key. So all these elements need to be out there. People have to know exactly how to know about this, how to deploy these type of projects, which are key for the energy transition at least in the United States right now. So policies like the 45Q are great to promote these type of projects. We know that when the first time the 45Q passed, about 30 projects in the US were announced, but there is also an amendment that is being evaluated to make sure that these projects are actually deployed, because I think many of them stayed in the announcement part. There is also other parts in the regulations, which is the Financing Our Energy Future Act, and the 45Q direct bill pay. So these are all recent, and it's very good to see that momentum that is taken for the regulatory part. And as I said, industry coming together, improving the lessons learned, guidelines, as I said, that the DNV, but I'm sure other entities will come with all the guidelines, will help educate much more people on how this has to be done. And we can take the steps to really have a bigger impact on the greenhouse gas emissions.
Great, very well summarized. Thank you, Martha. Well, that brings us to the end of our discussion that I greatly enjoyed. I think each one of you brought great value to the roundtable discussion on the subject of net zero. And on behalf of Hart Energy, thank you once again for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
For more Hart Energy videos, follow our social media channels.